I would like to start out by saying my experience in the world of psychedelic drugs is not that extensive, having only tried LSD roughly 5 times and a few half-assed salvia trips where I didn't quite break through. Also, another thing I would like to point out is that even though I am a heavier guy, I've always found that these substances affect me extremely well, and I don't need any more than an average weighing male of my age to get the job done. This was not my first time taking 2CE. I had 2 previous experiences which were both either right at 10 milligrams or just under. As for my dose, I'm aware this is a big no-no, but I did eyeball the amount taken. Erowid note: 2 samples of powder, even of the same chemical, with equivalent volumes won't necessarily weigh the same. For this reason, eyeballing is an inaccurate and potentially dangerous method of measuring, particularly for substances that are active in very small amounts. See this article on the importance of measured doses. The small baggie I had obtained was supposedly 20 milligrams, and I poured it onto a flat surface and divided what I thought was into 2 equal parts. So in theory I only took 10 milligrams. However, based on my previous experiences, this was either just much better product or I misjudged my dose by a decent amount. So for the record, I'll just say 14 milligrams. After I received my 2CE, I started planning out a day when I would have work off and would have nothing to do for the whole night. After a week or 2, this day presented itself and all was ready to go. The only thing that went wrong is I didn't get a nap in that day. I wake up extremely early for work and I like to be well rested for my trip. But I didn't let that bother me. Aside from being a bit tired, I did have a bit of a head cold. Neither of those 2 things really affected my trip significantly. I ate a light meal around 7:30 and waited around until everyone else in the house settled down for the night. Soon enough it was time. Time of ingestion 11:22 p.m. I decided I would just draw on my tablet to help pass the time during the come up and chat on Skype with a good friend of mine. Right after midnight is when I first started to notice the first effects. The picture I was working on started to wiggle and breathe some. This took me off guard because I am used to feeling something in my body before I start hallucinating, but I was pleased to see it was starting to kick in all the same. Within 15 after I first noticed the breathing, I looked down at my carpet and noticed it looked like there was some kind of pattern starting to take form, almost as if someone had just sat something heavy there and the impression was lingering around. At about this time I also noticed the light that my lamp was giving off had a bit of color in it, almost red, bluish. At this point more and more hallucinations started to occur fairly rapidly. I looked at a Radiohead poster hanging in my closet and it looked as if it were breathing, which is fairly familiar to me from acid and the previous 2CE trips. I started to feel more of the body load and my stomach muscles started tensing up like they usually do. And my leg muscles were starting to do something odd. I couldn't tell if they were just twitching or if I was shivering from suddenly starting to feel really cold. It wasn't unsettling, just something I noticed. I heard rain starting to fall outside my window, which relaxed me and made me happy for some reason. I left my room to go look out the huge windows at the front of my house so I could see the storm. But I could see my dad was still awake, so I quickly retreated back to my room. Walking was a bit odd and wobbly at first, but then I got used to it and had no trouble moving around. This was about an hour and a half after ingestion and I was definitely feeling it 100% now. I walked into the bathroom and looked into the mirror. A dark black-gray runic pattern was starting to grow over my face. And I looked down and it was all over my bathroom sink walls. It would pulse in and out of vision and I found it extremely interesting, so I kept staring. After a few moments I noticed my face in the reflection doing something and I realized half of my face was being reflected symmetrically perfect on the other side of my face. This was when I decided I had been staring into the mirror for long enough and went to lay down on my bed. I turned off all of the lights and pulled out a pack of glow sticks I had purchased earlier that day. I held about 10 or so in my hand and cracked them all at once. It was simply breathtaking. The contrast of all the different colors so bright and vivid next to each other just made me extremely happy, and I stared and played with them for a good while. At about 2 hours in, I started to get a little shaky in my limbs and all of my muscles were very tense. I did a bit of stretching, which felt great, and I decided to lay back down on my bed with some music playing in my headphones. I decided to close my eyes, and I was blown away. The first thing I noticed is that everything seemed to be three-dimensional, which was a first for me. I saw ever-growing thorny vines wrapping and tangling around an enormous tree. After that, I was looking into a tunnel in which several shards of a mirror were being suspended by glass rods. As I looked at each of these shards, I realized I was looking at my own eye, and each different piece reflected a different section of my eye. The most astonishing thing I saw, however, was a dark landscape which hosted a city with bright lights. A gigantic octopus descended upon the city and started moving over it. He would use his camouflage to take on the pattern and look of the city, and would change his color every few seconds or so. I was listening to the Campfire Headphase album by Boards of Canada, which seemed to go along with the visuals flawlessly. After I saw the giant octopus, I decided to open my eyes to see how things were looking. The room was very dark and there were patterns within patterns filling up every shadow. I felt it was time for a break from the music, so I turned off my MP3 player and just laid there and thought. I like thinking while tripping, but this was a whole new level. After being there for a few minutes in silence, my mind became completely severed from my body. If I could feel my physical form, I didn't notice it. I was suddenly thinking about all of these things that I had never thought about before, or even could have comprehended thinking about. I was just a soul floating through space and time, simply being. I reflected on my life. What is most important to me at this stage in my life? Who I was. How strange it was that I had a body I would eventually be returning to. I was pure thought, and the whole time I was as clear and level-headed as I could be. Ideas weren't flying at me at 1,000 miles per hour like they do on acid. I could start thinking about something and let it sink in and play with that thought for as long as I felt content, and then move on to the next. At one point it felt like my mind split open and poured out. The only way I could describe it was I could think in 360 degrees. I saw the whole picture with ease and realized things I didn't even believe possible. I was in this state for about an hour or so when I suddenly became aware that I was slowly but surely returning to baseline. For the next 2 or 3 hours I just sat in awe of what had happened while enjoying more hallucinations and messing around with the glow sticks. I noticed that on the come down I could focus more on my music and how it affected me much more emotionally. One particular song that played almost said my name and really caught my attention. I recently moved back home from a fairly good distance away where I was living with a few good friends. We would trip together and listen to music, with this one song being particularly memorable from a few specific nights. I spent the duration of that song engulfed in the music, and it stirred up all kinds of nostalgia, sadness, longing, and happiness, as well as some things I hadn't quite felt before. If I could use one word to describe those 3 minutes, it would be beautiful. At one point, at least 5 hours after ingestion, I thought I was done tripping completely when I looked outside my window up at the night sky. The trees were swaying and the clouds seemed to be moving in fast forward. It took me a few moments to realize they were drifting along at the same pace clouds usually do. I can't quite recall when I fell asleep, but I don't remember having any trouble doing so. Don't remember any dreams or anything. Just good sleep. The next day I woke up feeling great physically. No bad headache or hangover. My mood and emotions were a bit thrown off, however. I felt different or empty almost. Something wasn't quite on track. I spent a good portion of the day just being lazy and resting, trying to recall various bits of the previous night's journey, reflecting on what I had experienced and learned. I'm not sure how often, but I can say that I will definitely be experimenting more with this one. I can see how it can be intense and overwhelming, especially if I had taken a higher dosage. As I understand, the curve is very steep as you go up about every 2 milligrams or so. But at the same time, it really was an astonishing experience. I hope my growing relationship with this fascinating chemical remains a good one.